So I guess I want to ask a big question, overarching question about whether you think, we know you think that Davos Man has caused huge amount of wealth inequality. It made COVID worse than it needed to be. And it brought on the Donald Trump and these right-wing populist movements in other countries. Do you think that Davos Man is that venal and mendacious, or do you just think they're just not willing to try to change the status quo when they see that the status quo is harmful?
I wouldn't say venal and mendacious as a rule. Look, I know some of these guys. They're nice to their children. They can be fun to have a beer with. I mean, it's not. This book isn't about demonizing these particular individuals or billionaires or corporate CEOs. I think we can all be grateful that Jeff Bezos, who's clearly a visionary and a genius, pioneered e-commerce, and how could we have survived the pandemic without these incredible developments of technology, logistics? That's all great. I just think he has to pay taxes like everybody else. Like we can't live in a world where Jeff Bezos and Steve Schwarzman, who's a private equity magnate worth about $35 billion and who owns residences the way most of us own socks. We can't have these guys handing smaller slices of their income and wealth to the federal government than the people who are scrubbing the toilets in their multiple residences.
So if I were to, in a nutshell, describe what you're on a vendetta about, it's taxes.
No, it's more than taxes. It's antitrust enforcement. It's rules that allow labor to mobilize. I mean, it's about democracy being reasserted by the people who own it to have a say over the rules that govern the major economies in which we live, so that we don't just accept. I think that there is built into a lot of our journalism this false binary choice that Davos Man has very carefully insinuated into our discourse through compliant think tanks and star-loving access journalists and strategic communications firms. This idea that, like, if we monkey with the magic formula we've got now, then we might as well be Venezuela. Like if you ask, well, why can't Pfizer actually be forced to make their vaccines more available, or why can't we set aside intellectual property in the middle of a pandemic and make it possible for countries around the world to develop life-saving vaccines? Then you might as well be a Bolshevik. You might as well be arguing that we follow the North Korean development model. I mean, these things are absurd. I mean, we've lived through periods of American history where we've had much higher taxes, we've had antitrust enforcement, we've had much greater say by labor movements, and what we've had is much more equitable growth. We've had growth, we've had innovation. I don't have a fetish for the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I don't want a time machine backwards. We made a lot of social progress that we want to hang on to, but we got to get back to a kind of capitalism, and we do need capitalism. I mean, let's make no mistake about that. But we need a kind of capitalism that is regulated, so it's not just monopoly power and corporate welfare schemes that have taken over our government through selective lobbying. We need competition and innovation, and we need the benefits of growth to flow to people who work for a living.
So, and yet, if you look at what's happening in our political system today in the United States, you have most Republicans who still want to see Donald Trump president. They still believe, maybe even more so than he does, in what he stood for. You have Republicans in the Senate who still block the kinds of, maybe even a few Democrats who still block some of the most far-reaching legislation that Joe Biden wants to do, the things that you're talking about, to not help the wealthy class, not Davos Man, but the little man. And so it's not necessarily a case of Davos Man manipulating the system. These are voters.
But
No, these
everything
are
you're
voters.
saying is a product of manipulating the system.
This is the voting base of the Republican Party that
Really?
likes things the way they are.
Really? So you think that the status quo is a reflection of the popular will?
Well, I mean, people vote, right? They voted for Donald
Well,
Trump,
I
and
mean,
they
first of
would vote
all,
for him again.
we have a systematic attack on voting rights in many battleground states. Secondly, I mean, we can see with our own eyes in the state of California, people favor single payer healthcare. The governor campaigned on single payer healthcare. We're talking like 70+% of people want single payer healthcare. The health insurance lobby kicks into gear and they shut it down. I mean, the idea that we can somehow draw a line between Davos Man's machinations, which we can see with our own eyes. I mean, we can see that Amazon employs 100 lobbyists in Washington. Do we think it's coincidental that there are large numbers of people in the halls of Congress who are doing the bidding of Amazon, that that's an expression of belief and popular will? We think that huge numbers of Americans have looked carefully into the question of paid sick leave for service sector workers and have concluded that they shouldn't get it. I mean, what we have is a political process that's been so warped and taken over by the donor class that it no longer expresses the popular will in many cases, to the degree to which it's even a democracy at all, given the attack on voting rights. So no, I mean, I look at what you're describing in terms of the inability to make the sorts of changes that much of the public really wants as a sign that Davos Man is strong and effective and is unleashing his apparatus in the interest of perpetuating the status quo. And that's why we ought to be very, very suspicious of stakeholder capitalism, because Davos Man understands that if we had an expression of popular will, things would change. There would be wealth taxes. There would be an expansion of public health care. There would be assistance for people who need it, paying for higher education. The infrastructure would be built out. All of this stuff would cost money, and it would have to come from Davos Man. So Davos Man goes to Davos and talks about, win-win solutions. Everything's a win-win solution, and then perpetuates this idea that, oh, we have all these divisions in Washington, as if he's somehow not involved in that. We gotta wake up to the reality that none of this stuff's happening by accident.